to take a quick break. When we come back, it's a night of true crime right here on Coast to Coast AM. 4 years ago, when I was asked to fill in for George Noory, my very first guest on the show was Jeff Mudgett. Jeff is the great-great-grandson of America's most prolific serial killer, H.H. Holmes, also known as the Devil in the White City. He's authored a book called Bloodstains that talk about the horrendous crimes and the fact that Jeff has compiled some very important facts that may tie H.H. Holmes to the notorious Jack the Ripper. He's been investigating this tirelessly for over 20 years, piecing together this very strange and twisted puzzle. His show was just aired on the History Channel, and it was fascinating, along with Amaryllis Fox, the co-host, who is a filmmaker, peace activist, and former CIA clandestine service officer. They investigated this theory and took it through many different veins, and really, even after 20 years of investigating, revealed new information that even Jeff was not privy to. He's back tonight to talk to us about some of these startling new finds, some of these startling new changes, and we're going to also talk about some items that weren't covered on the show. Jeff Mudgett, welcome back. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Hey, Dave, thanks for having me back on. I can remember that first time I came on with you and how that pretty much changed my life, your show, and how it led to my TED Talk, and then finally History Channel offering me the co-host of American Ripper.
This is a fascinating twist. Now, let's start from the beginning. For people that may not be familiar with your story, I gave a brief little declaration, but at what point in your life did you find out that you were related to H.H. Holmes?
Yeah, when I was about 40 years old, Dave, my grandfather revealed to the family the secret that he'd been holding to himself, that we were the direct descendants of perhaps the most evil man in American history. And that revelation basically changed my life. I gave up my career as a trial lawyer in California and decided to pursue, the journey to see which facts, which stories about Holmes were legend, and which were lore, and which were the truth. And as you know, Dave, having been with me on this journey for years now, the deeper we went into the Holmes story, the stranger the history became, and until finally, we had an 8-part series on television, which I got to tell you has almost a cult following now, and the final episode set records as far as viewing for history.
It was an amazing series, honestly. I didn't know what they were going to do with it. I had some fear and trepidation, as I am a friend of yours and a fan of your work, and wasn't sure exactly how they were going to do this, but I was really impressed by the entire production and incorporating Amaryllis throughout the show as somebody who is an investigator and, again, was the skeptical aspect of this investigation. It was great to kind of get that different outlook on this entire thing. You find out from your grandfather this deep, dark secret. What made him decide to finally come forward and share this part of your family history?
My grandmother was doing some research, Dave, about our lineage, and she had this theory that we were related to the Civil War General Robert E. Lee. And this was back in the time before Ancestry.com, when you had to hire outfits to do this tracking of your lineage for you, and it was quite expensive. And she had hired this outfit for 2 or 3 years, and they finally came back to her, Dave, and pretty much told her to let sleeping dogs lie, that we weren't related to the Civil War general, that we were related to a criminal who had been hung by the neck until dead in Arkansas because of stealing a horse. They had kind of fudged the story. Well, my
yeah,
brother,
just a little.
Just a little. My brother was helping my grandmother with this story, and he had dug in a little further than that. And he knew about the murder castle in Chicago. He knew about our ancestor being this doctor from the University of Michigan who had specialized in, torture and experimenting with innocent victims. And well, the story took off from there. And like I said earlier, the more you dig into this, the more of the hundreds of books written about Holmes you read, you realize this is someone who history has pretty much shoved aside, Dave. I don't know if it's because we don't want to admit it was possible in America for a real-life Dr. Frankenstein to have existed or not. But I think the story has finally began to come about, and I'm eagerly awaiting now for Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio to do the epic movie, which is said to be being made now about the Devil in the White City.
Well, to get this weird bit of your family history uncovered, that's one thing. But walk me through the next evolution of this story, if you will. How do you go from, oh my God, my great-great-grandfather was a horrific man, a criminal, and probably one of the most nefarious citizens of the United States for many years, to, I think he may have been Jack the Ripper as well. How do you start to make that jump?
You know, Dave, I was contacted by a gentleman from Pennsylvania named Mark Potts, who had been studying the possibility that Holmes was Jack the Ripper for over 10 years of his life, and he had come up with some interesting evidence. And I, when he first came to me with the possibility, had the same reaction that most people have when I raise the possibility to them. They doubt, they're skeptical, they don't believe the evidence we show. Well, Mark kept after me and kept pushing until finally that trial lawyer that I had been began to consider the evidence without bias and preconceived notions. And as I explained to you and George on the shows that I've been on with you, the evidence, when someone opens their mind to consider the possibilities, is quite astounding. And as the show demonstrates, we've a mountain of circumstantial evidence establishing Holmes was Jack the Ripper. And Dave, I have to tell you, in all honesty, I have no doubt whatsoever. And if you were to ask me, Jeff, can you prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Holmes is Jack the Ripper? I'd tell you honestly, no. But can I establish a probable cause, which, if Holmes were alive today, would allow me to go out and get an arrest warrant for him to stand trial for the murders of Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride? Yes, that's my profession. That's what I used to do, and I believe we could absolutely have him arrested to stand trial for those murders.
All right. And again, since I announced that you're going to be on the show, I've been just dealing with a deluge of emails from naysayers and believers alike. And it is funny, the derision line that I see in this, that some people are just so closed off to the possibilities and the idea that it could be. And I've always appreciated the fact that you say, listen, just be open-minded about it. Listen to the facts as they are presented, not manipulated, not twisted, but these are facts that we do know. And once you start to walk that Occam's razor, right, what is left over? And it sure seems to point to the fact that your great-great-grandfather may very well have been Jack the Ripper. So let's start a little bit of a timeline here, because I think a lot of people are under the assumption that during the midst of Holmes's heyday of murder and mayhem, he suddenly went to London, and you would have us believe that then he started killing people there and then returned back to the United States. But that, in fact, is not the way this story breaks down or starts up. So talk us through this timeline, and you did it so eloquently on the TV series. But give us some idea of when he started his crime spree and what brought him to England.
No, and you're exactly correct, Dave, about that gap in time when we can establish where Holmes was in Chicago, in America, when he came back to America. And one of the reasons why we were so interested in Amaryllis assisting me in this investigation and journey was, we were aware of her work for the CIA. She had a reputation of being an incredible investigator who was open-minded to the possibilities of different scenarios. History, I got History to help me enlist her to co-host on the show. And Dave, when we started, she was quite skeptical. She didn't believe at all that my theory was correct. At the end of the show, I think you can see just her reactions on the air, that changed completely to where she now is if not a firm believer, one who accepts the probability that the theory is true. And Dave, the two most critical components of my theory that had been left open, where the skeptics jump in every time, was that gap when Holmes wasn't in Chicago, and the fact that he had ridden the liners from New York over to Whitechapel. So if you think back to episode 4 and 5, you'll see that I asked history if I could intentionally stay out of those scenes, that if Amaryllis could handle that gap and that ride over on the ships to London herself, because I knew if I stepped into that, the doubters, the ripperologists, would say that's just Mudgett pushing his theory. But
right, now let's line this up again for people.
Yeah.
Your great-great-grandfather, not just a murderer, but a con man and a shyster from day one. He would set up businesses to fail and collect on insurance policies. He would set in life insurance policies on friends and coworkers and employees and bump them off and collect on that. He was constantly grifting and buying properties or buying things and shifting it and never really making good. So there was this huge paper trail throughout his entire life as an adult of lawsuits and issues with the courts. And that's not just in Chicago area. This guy was also mucking about in New York and a few other places. So there was always a paper trail to follow. I mean, and it was a very well-defined paper trail, but that paper trail suddenly drops off. And it just so happens to coincide with when the Whitechapel murders begin. And then this paper trail picks back up very shortly after the last murder in London in the Whitechapel district, and picks back up throughout the United States and in many different states. But there is this huge, undeniable gap of information of his activities. And it's hard to believe that a man who was such a con artist and was constantly trying to pull the wool over somebody's eyes would just go silent during this time everywhere. And it just happens that block of time, murders begin in London.
No, I think you've explained it splendidly well. The time before the Ripper killings start, we know exactly where Holmes was, what he was doing. As a matter of fact, what real estate he was purchasing in the United States. And we know when the Ripper killings stopped, Dave, that construction began on the murder castle at 63rd and Wallace in Chicago. And in between, we have nothing. I mean, there have been historians that have tried to establish he was here or there, and we tracked down those theories that they had, and they amounted to zero. And then when we went to look at the passenger lists for the ships to London,
and this is for
was able to find his name.
Right, and that is unbelievably strange, right? I mean, here you stayed out of this and just said, we need to check manifests from passenger lines. And it just so happens that just prior to the murders in London again, lo and behold, a Herman H. Holmes took a journey over to London. And you also find in the manifest one of his well-known aliases coming back just after the final murder, coming back, and then the paper trail within a short time picks back up again.
And Amaryllis did an incredible job with that part of the investigation. And as you stated, I needed to stay out of that. I needed someone with her training and her ability to nail down that issue, because if I got involved, I knew the doubters would rise up. And Dave, I think if you go back and see that episode, you'll see what an incredible job she did establishing that fact.
How hard is it? I mean, you would think that finding original ship manifests of passengers over 100 years ago still in existence, it seems like that's a pretty thin basis. Like that, how is that going to be? Were you surprised? I mean, honestly surprised that they were able to dig that information up when they brought it to your attention?
That's the first time I've been asked, and yes, I was surprised. I doubted whether we would find facts of that nature to establish that part of my theory, which was a gap, and which had been attacked over and over again. Even on your show, the show that I came on with, the expert you had, the criminologist who, I remember he and I arguing over your show on that issue. And you've got to remember, Dave, this was 20 years of my life where I was researching this by myself. When the wonderful people at History decided they believed my theory and they wanted to present this to the world, we had hundreds of people researching, Dave, these facts, and the material that they came up with was so far beyond anything I'd ever been able to dig up. It was amazing, and you can see it over and over again during the episodes of the show. You can see it on my face. There are times when I'm shocked at the new material and evidence that we came up with.
And let me just say this so I can avoid the onslaught of emails I'll get. People are already posting on my social media accounts. And what I find very funny regarding this case is, everybody has an opinion. Everybody believes one thing or another. And these armchair quarterbacks that are looking at the case and tell me, hey, I watched the entire series and this is what I know and Jeff is wrong. I perplexed by the fact that somebody knows the truth simply by watching your series, which depicts a story that really leaves you very little doubt that there's, any other possibilities. It's not saying that there aren't possibilities, and you and your co-host Amaryllis definitely left that open. But the fact is that other people are so decisive and they know, but they haven't spent 20 years of their lives trying to, and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of their own money to try to look into this. We're going to continue with Jeff Mudgett. We're going to hear more of the story and some of the other unbelievable aspects of Holmes's journey that really starts to tie us into the fact that there very well could be a tie between the Devil in the White City and the Whitechapel Killer. We'll do that next on Coast to Coast AM. Thank you for joining me this evening as we have a full night of true crime. We'll come back. We've got more about the American Ripper, Jack the Ripper, and H.H. Holmes. Could they be the same man? Our guests believe so. We'll talk about that next on Coast to Coast AM. We're back on Coast to Coast AM. Listen, I work with a lot of production companies across the United States and around the world that are always looking for your stories. And right now, I'm working with a production company. They are casting and looking for a few more stories for a brand new series that is already contracted to go onto a major network. And they are looking for people that have had terrifying firsthand accounts of the paranormal where you are left terrified by the experience and what happened to you. And they are specifically looking for stories of abduction, paranormal abduction as well. So if you are one of those people, you can email me, dave@darknessradio.com, or that's dave@darknessradio.com. Include a short bio, a little bit about what happened to you and your phone number and ways to contact you, and I will forward them on to the production company. But if you've been abducted, or you believe you've been abducted, or you've had other bone-chilling, terrifying encounters with the paranormal that you're willing to recount over a 1-hour period on a TV series for reenactment, then contact me, dave@darknessradio.com, and we'll make sure to put you in touch with the production companies. Our guest this evening is one of the hosts and stars of History Channel's American Ripper series. He's a great-great-grandson of America's first most prolific serial killer and murderer, H.H. Holmes. And as I was saying leading into the break, Jeff, just before people get a chance to start emailing me and you think you know the answers, and if you've just done it by reading some articles and other people's agendas online, give some credit where credit is due. I appreciate everybody's aspects that have actually put time in real research, not just reading what they find online, but putting in research of looking these parts of history up, much like you guys did in the TV series, and as you've done over the last 20 years. Just so you understand, I'm going to take people like Jeff and other researchers who are looking at the same topic. I have not come to settle on the fact that Holmes is the Ripper yet, but I am certainly most intrigued by this story as it continues to unfold. And I'm open to the possibilities and probabilities. And believe it or not, so is Jeff. He loves to hear the different stories and theories on this. But again, he when you make a definitive answer one way or another, it's it's hard to swallow for anybody. And I'm not just talking about Jeff, but I mean for any of the people out there listening who think they've figured this out because they've watched a bunch of, programs and have read a few things online. You really need to get your hands dirty and into the investigation process to understand just how detailed the show went. Now, Jeff, do you in the Bloodstains book, you refer to, kind of this ledger that was kept by Holmes. I've had a lot of people ask me, is this a work of fiction just to help move the book along, or was there some real diary that does kind of open up some of these points?
Dave, Bloodstains is fiction based on a true story, and when I first published the book, I agonized over the question you're asking for months, and I went back to In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, how authors like Eric Larson and Devil in the White City fill in gaps by themselves and still call the work nonfiction. And I decided I couldn't do that. So one of the ways in which I did that was to use that ledger, as you stated, in the story to try to cover the gaps that the H.H. Holmes story will always have. And I think it came off very well, and I think my readers can understand where I was trying to go with that. And obviously, people like History and the production company that I work with worked around that and came up with a great story. And I think when you go back and you look at the periods of time that I was trying to cover, I mean, Dave, if you just take this for example, if you and I rode back in time with H.G. Wells and we filmed H.H. Holmes in Whitechapel murdering Catherine Eddowes, and we brought that video back for your show, Dave, we would still have ripperologists and skeptics doubting that Holmes was Jack the Ripper. That's how tough Jack the Ripper and ripperology is. I mean, there's 2 or 3 new suspects every year, Dave, and I've learned that despite my trying to argue to people that, listen, Jack the Ripper is the junior varsity compared to H.H. Holmes. The world should be trying to prove that Jack the Ripper was H.H. Holmes, not me, that he was Jack the Ripper. But that's the way it's set up. That's the way it's always going to be. Jack the Ripper is a huge business in the entertainment world, and I don't think that will ever change. And there's, quite frankly, Dave, I've got thousands of fans who firmly believe that there are people who don't want me to prove that Holmes was Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, I've never really understood that aspect because I hear to me, what I think is a very flawed concept that we can never have a true answer. That will ruin the tourism. I don't understand how that ruins tourism. I mean, it is what it is. It just adds to the tourism. It now gives a face to the villain. It doesn't make the crimes any less heinous. It doesn't make the story any less real by knowing who did the story. So to me, that's always been the weakest aspect of the, we'll never get to the answer because there's too much business in not knowing. I understand for authors, there's a lot of business because everybody wants to come forward with a theory on this. But let's talk about that theory. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they do believe is the fact that it is an American and most likely a doctor that was involved in these crimes, correct? How did they get to that aspect?
Dave, when you go back and you research the initial impressions of Scotland Yard, the London Metropolitan Police, the London media, they all believed it was an American doctor who committed those murders. It's history that has fudged that away from that aspect. As a matter of fact, as we tried to describe in the show, Dave, Scotland Yard followed Holmes back across the Atlantic to research Ripper-like murders in New York, and would have gone on to Chicago had I believed they had the budget to do so. But, they were called back home. And that to me, I never have understood, Dave, why, serious historians have tried to sidestep the fact that Scotland Yard came to America to try to find the Ripper.
I think on one aspect, could it be, and I mean, playing along on this idea of remaining open-minded, though, could it be that the British populace and the government wanted to try to point the finger at an American because they just did not want to believe that this type of crime would be committed by one of their citizens.
True, which is why on episode 4 we went to those two of the most highly renowned linguists in the UK, and we had them research the Dear Boss letter, and they both came to the conclusion, which they stated unequivocally on the show, that Dear Boss was written by an American trying to sound English. And you know, when you put that,
and explain what the Dear Boss letter is, and the letters that you had looked at. Were they letters supposedly sent by the Ripper, and how did that come about?
The Dear Boss letter was a letter by the killer to the London media predicting the next murders of Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride. And Saucy Jack was the letter after those murders bragging about them. And while there were many letters written at the time to London media and the police, those two are probably the highest regarded as far as possibly being direct evidence of the murders and of the killer. So when I came on your show years ago, I explained to you how at the TED we had run the Dear Boss letter and some of Herman's, H.H. Holmes's handwriting through the computers at the University of Buffalo, and they'd come back with these amazing numbers establishing a similarity in the handwriting. So when we went to London, we showed those results to those linguists, but then we wanted them to try to establish the writing used and the words that the killer applied to that letter. And just the title itself, Dave, Dear Boss, was an American phrase. It wasn't English. And that to me was just another step, another peg in the puzzle that, proves, while it may not prove that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper, it does establish that he was definitely an American who simply bought a ticket home, Dave, when he got tired of either murdering in London or scared that he was going to be, arrested and incarcerated.
Well, let's talk about the MO. That is the thing that seems to come up the most from the skeptics in this case, is that the Ripper murders and Holmes's murders were two totally different styles, so there's no way that they could be the same guy. Let's walk through what you guys discovered for the show.
And that's an interesting point, because I've always wondered why people are so, convinced that the MOs were different. I'm not aware of any MOs in America, Dave. He murdered innocents in the basement of his hotel, the Murder Castle in Chicago. We don't know what MOs he had or what methods he used. While in London, he had a different opportunity to murder and then return away from that police pressure once he felt it was too much. And Amaryllis came up with a concept that I thought was genius. In the middle of the show, we're filming, Dave, during two of the sets, and she decides, wait a minute, because two or three of the producers and the director, they were with you on the MOs being different and how it affected my theory of proving Holmes was the Ripper. She decided, wait a minute, this was when he was 25 to 30 years old. He murdered, and his MOs had evolved from his first murders as a child in Gilmington, the show believed, and then into London. And then when he decided that the Mary Kelly murder had been a little bit too graphic and too open for police inspection, decided when he got back to Chicago, Dave, and before the World's Fair, he wanted to build that factory of death at 63rd and Wallace to where he could conduct those tortures, those crimes, those experiments in his privacy, and then be able to reduce the human remains that were left so that he could escape arrest and imprisonment.
Right. The initial 4 canonical murders of the Ripper were quick, they were decisive, they were in the middle of very public areas.
Yes.
And then the Mary Jane Kelly, he had the chance to be alone with this girl in a closed room, and he took much more time and pleasure in the violence that he did, which, again, as she denotes in the episode, listen, that was his aha moment. That is the serial killer, and most serial killers do progress. They start off maybe sloppy and scared at first, and then as they slowly progress, they realize, oh, I can do it differently this way and avoid this or avoid that. And once he had a taste for being able to take his time and vivisect his victims like this, that's what you believe. That's the idea that you guys threw out, that is what led him to return to the United States, because this is an important aspect. The murder castle did not exist before he left. It was when he returned that the murder castle began, correct?
Yeah, and I got to tell you, I was listening to her project that theory of evolution of MO as the audience did, as you did watching the show. And because I got to tell you, I had problems with MO as well. And as she explained it, how his mind had evolved, committing these crimes, knowing what he needed to do to escape arrest if he wanted to continue murdering, I thought it made a lot of sense, and I think the show did a great job of describing that theory in a way that the audience could understand.
Right, and a lot of people made comments of, oh, now they're just trying to force a round peg into a square hole, but that's not the case. It's looking at this, and you have a CIA agent, former CIA agent, whose job it was to try to understand patterns and look at the way crimes and criminals and terrorists work. So putting this together does make sense from that angle. And you can see the progression of his skill, and he, same with his cons. His cons started off very sloppy, and he progressively got more and more grandiose as he continued on, much like his murders.
And that's exactly correct. And I said at the start of your show, Amaryllis thought I was full of baloney when we started, and no one at History or the production company forced her opinion in any way or asked her to say anything she didn't completely agree or believe in. And, I worked with her for a year, Dave, and you could see her absorbing the evidence, working it into her theory of this evolution of crime and methods. And I got to tell you, I think she came up with something that was hugely missing in actually how I was trying to explain to the world that Holmes was the Ripper, and I'm eternally grateful to her for it.
We've got a lot to cover, and I know we're already at the top of the hour. We only have 1 hour left together this evening, and there are a lot of new revelations. Let's talk about, as I think we've got just a few minutes left in this segment, Jeff. Literally about a minute and a half left here together. How many different points did you suddenly uncover during the filming of the show, and having much more access to historians and researchers? Did you find a lot that you had never uncovered before, or was it just a few gems that you had kicked over during the show?
Dave, I've got to tell you, almost every scene, the incredible researchers and historians at History came up with something new that I was amazed at. I mean, the scene when we were in Irvington, Indiana, when we had that box of Holmes mementos, do you remember that?
Right, yeah. This was something that reportedly he had left behind, correct?
Oh, the first real photo of his assistant, Pat Quinlan, the documents from the University of Michigan, the London-built, made surgical tools that he had brought back from London with him, and then the tintype of one of the Ripper victims. I got to tell you, and then when Amaryllis, see this brilliant woman. I wish she was on the show tonight again. We're going through that box, Dave, and she grabs that tintype and says, "Whoa! We got to take this to a man I know that puts this together on 3D." And we ran it to this man, and he came up with that image with like a 70% likelihood that tintype in that box that was in Irvington, Indiana, was a Ripper victim. And while, you might have thousands of doubters on your show listening right now, Dave, that to me was an astounding piece of evidence.
I agree. Fascinating. And yes, we originally had Amaryllis to join us, but because of the nature of her business, sometimes she is called away to do work that she needs to get done. So she was unable to join us last minute. She did her best to try to be here with us. But we do have Jeff for an entire hour. It's an evening of true crime. This hour we'll be talking more about the American Ripper. If you'd like to meet Jeff Mudgett in person, I'll also be with him the first weekend in October at the big Chicago Paracon. You can find information by visiting darknessevents.com. That's darknessevents.com. You'll get a chance to meet with Jeff Mudgett and hear a full-on presentation. Plus, he'll be signing copies of his books, and they're for pictures and meet and greets as well. I'll be on hand emceeing the entire weekend, so you can get tickets again at darknessevents.com. Just click on the Chicago Paracon banner, and you'll find other locations you can visit me at throughout the year. All right, Jeff, I want to dig into a lot of the new revelations from the series. One of the things that was really impressive to me at first glance was taking a look at over 100-year-old eyewitness accounts of Jack the Ripper and what people saw, what this man looked like, and having a forensic sketch artist create a profile image of this killer. And the matchup was pretty compelling when you put them side by side and even overlaid them over well-known pictures of H.H. Holmes. I know that was something that you had kind of bandied about in the past with the idea, but were you even surprised at just how close that image looked?
No, and the expert that we obtained to do this is one of the most renowned in the UK, and her work, using those descriptions from, like you say, most people don't realize there were 13 eyewitness accounts of Jack the Ripper, and then putting them into, her computer program, which allowed us to come back with an image. While it may have amazed some, you have to remember, Dave, the BBC and Scotland Yard did it 15 years ago as well, and came up with an image that looks like Holmes just as much as this new experts did. So I wasn't surprised at all. I knew we had a man that was 5'7", 150 pounds, 25 to 35 years old, and looked remarkably like H.H. Holmes.
Now, with that said, as I said, I'm not going to take one position over another, but bringing up some interesting aspects of the story. There is another American doctor who was very bizarre, and his name was Francis Tumblety. They know that he was in England around that time. There's a famous picture of him where he's got this big, strange handlebar mustache, but there are other pictures where he looks very much like H.H. Holmes and the Jack the Ripper images that are out there. You have an American doctor with similar looks. That's kind of like today when somebody says, oh, yeah, he was bald with a goatee and heavy set. Well, in Minnesota, I look like 80% of the male population at this point. So making an image of me might look like, as a matter of fact, I do dumb crimes and stupid criminal shows on our Tuesday shows, and I have people that send me articles all the time with police sketch artists of some criminal that did something, and it's funny to me that the guys look just like me in the sketch images or in the grainy photographs that they captured. That was kind of the look, and at that time people were a little bit more slight and had a very similar look to it. I mean, do you give into that aspect of it as well, that although that's an intriguing part of the story, that is still one that borders a little bit on the fragile?
No, and I agree with you 100%, Dave, on that. And when I first started my investigation whether Holmes could be Jack the Ripper, I put some thought into whether I wanted to go down that path that so many historians make when they try to become experts of all the different suspects, and there's over 100 of them, Dave. I decided against that, and what I wanted to do was I wanted to become more expert at the different aspects that the killer had to have followed or been a part of in order to be a viable suspect. And when you stack up, like the doctor you mentioned, or Kosminski, any of the major suspects in Ripper lore, and Holmes, when we actually had a scene about this that history decided they didn't have time to run, but we labeled the different bullet points that the killer had to have complied with in order to be considered a suspect. And all of them, Dave, miss bullet points. All of them except one. Holmes fits every bullet point there is. And that's, you know what, well, like at the beginning of the show when I told you, do I have enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Holmes is Jack the Ripper? No. Will I ever have that evidence? No. But I've got enough for the world to finally consider there's this American doctor that went on to Chicago and killed 10, 20, 30, hundreds of people during the World's Fair. And lo and behold, he was in London during the time of Jack the Ripper. And it's time we started looking at it with a more open mind, as you so ably described when we started.
I am fascinated. People are still fascinated by this case because, again, it's an open case, much like the Lindbergh baby case and all of this. What really happened? Who was really involved? This is something that always captures when you have, D.B. Cooper, when you have possibilities and all of these probabilities and kind of tying them up. When we come back, we have to take another quick break. When we come back, though, Jeff, let's quickly outline some of what you uncovered for this series that you feel are the biggest points that really have helped cement this for you. And on the other side, I want you to be open. Were there any points that you had always believed were really solid that once you got into the scrutiny of it and really examined it, kind of fell apart? We'll talk about that when we return. I'm your host this evening, Dave Schrader, filling in for George Noory, and this is the one. It is the only. It's the iconic Coast to Coast AM. You can check out more about my guest at his website, bloodstainsthebook.com, bloodstainsthebook.com, and you can find the episodes, if you missed them, on the History Channel website or on the History Channel app. That's how I kept up on them while I was out on the road and traveling. Check it out for yourself. This is a fascinating series. Go into it open-minded and just take a look at the evidence presented. I'd love to hear from you, even after the case that this show's over. What are your thoughts on this? And if you have thoughts about this case and questions that you want me to weave into the interview this evening, you can email me, dave@darknessradio.com. Please keep the questions short because I don't have time to read 3 paragraphs to get to one question while I'm talking to our guest. Jeff, all right, quickly, let's start going over some of the let's start off with, were there any pieces of what you believe there to be evidence that you went into this TV series with that ended up falling apart under scrutiny?
Dave, I've always had issues. I know what type of man Holmes was. The man that liked to write letters to the London media, the man that liked to brag about his exploits, the man that wrote his memoirs while in prison and sold them to Hearst, for $7,500, who actually described murdering innocent women. I've always had issue with, and it's been raised to me numerous times. I think maybe even on your show you raised it. Why didn't he brag about the Whitechapel murders in his memoirs? That has always bothered me. And Amaryllis and I actually sat down and discussed it. I was hoping maybe her training could lead to some point where I could accept. And when you prosecute a murder trial, Dave, there are chinks in the case, every crime committed, that you cannot 100% convince the jury fits, but you have to try to explain to them why it doesn't. So I tried to get Amaryllis to do that with me. And she came up with an interesting concept, which when he wrote his memoirs, 1890s, maybe Jack the Ripper wasn't so famous as we think of it now, and Holmes was quite bored with those murders when he considered the other ones that he committed. So Like I say, that has always bothered me. The part of the evidence, Dave, that we came up with that is.
Well, can I mention one thing on that, Jeff? Sorry. Just, and this will actually, I think, help you in that progression. Listen, if he was not a dumb man, this guy was a genius with what he was doing. And yes, although he liked to brag and he was very forthright about a lot of what he was doing, that just seeming like he never felt like he was going to be caught. He wasn't stupid, and he knew the heat was on with the London Ripper murders, and he liked what he was doing. he wanted to continue this. So it would make no sense for a man logically to put himself in the crosshairs if he wanted to continue this bloodbath journey. So to me, it makes complete sense why he never bragged. It didn't before, but as you look at the evidence now and the MO and the excite factor and how he saw this thing opening up and the potential of building this murder castle, it makes complete sense to me of why he kept it quiet.
Well, those are good points, and whether they were before or after he had been sentenced to death would be an interesting point on that. But when people ask me about Holmes and how he thought, Dave, I tend to go down the line you just went. Here was a man of incredible intellect and a high IQ, who never even attended classes at the University of Michigan, but graduated with his doctorate degree. That's how smart he was. And when you try to predict what he would say or wouldn't say, you're entering grounds that I don't know if anyone can accurately estimate or predict.
Now, some of the points that you really were astounded to uncover. We already found the manifest showing that somebody named Herman Holmes went to London right before the murders, and somebody using one of his most well-known aliases came back, and then the murders started picking up again. That's a pretty good case. We also see that the way he did his murders, and the MO was similar in the case of him kind of smothering and quickly stabbing women in the Ripper murders and then subduing them with gases and other ways to knock them out by drugging them in the murder castle, kind of continued that vein of evil. So we see some of those aspects. We also see that the imagery matches up. We see that handwriting and analysis matches up, and that it was believed by Scotland Yard that it was an American and most likely a doctor, and that matches with our number one suspect here. What were some of the other pieces that you guys uncovered that really started to excite you even more, that you realized, oh my God, my thoughts and ideas are really coming together here? This is astounding.
I tell you, there was a piece, I think in episode 5, when we were in Chicago, Dave, and we were dealing with the ex-detective Ray Johnston, who had done some research regarding Ripper-style murders in Chicago that hadn't been reported. And do you remember the time scale that he put together, where before Holmes came back to Chicago, there were 0. While he was in Chicago, the number went up to this huge number, and then when he was arrested, it stopped. Do you remember that?
Yes.
That, to me, had I been on a jury and seen that evidence, and Holmes had been the defendant under trial, that would have been incredibly difficult for me not to have put a weight on as far as evidence of guilt. That really astounded me. And before the show, Dave, I had no idea that was a fact.
All right, so there's another great point for you as you're researching this and developing more. What were some of the other points that you came out with that were astounding?
Well, Ray came up with another concept, Dave, about Holmes's concrete factory along the Chicago River.
Yes.
Here was a man that owned a concrete factory that never sold any, but he bought the components for concrete. And Ray's theory was that Holmes had created concrete blocks, put bodies inside, and then dropped them into the Chicago River. And we went out with the engineers and the sonar equipment and found some evidence of possible blocks in the river. But when we went to the city, the state, and the federal government for permission to dig in the silt, all 3 of them said no.
Why would that be? You would think that if they think there are body parts there, and maybe it had nothing to do with Holmes, if they're seeing something that is out of place and shouldn't be there, why would they not investigate that?
You know, Dave, it's the same as the federal government wouldn't allow us to run sonar on the lawn at 63rd and Wallace where the murder capsule is, when we assured them we would not interrupt their post office operations. I don't know what it is about government administrations and, digging up history. Perhaps the Chicago River, they were concerned about the toxic nature of the silt. I'm not an environmentalist. I don't know what is or isn't there. All I know is we had 3 firms definitely not when we asked permission.
And I don't get that. That frustrates me. Even in current cases, for murder cases, Jeff, it's frustrating how they seem to, the government seems to cut its own throat in allowing a real investigation to take place. Now, the skeptical side of this can say, because they already know there's nothing there, and, why bother doing this? But we don't have to play that angle up on the TV. Were you afraid that might have been the case, that they already knew, or this had been dug up at some point?
No, and we explained to them, the incredible people at History were willing to fund that investigation for us to find those blocks. And it wasn't any skin off anyone's nose. We wouldn't have interfered with any operations in the river. And we explained to them that we wouldn't make it a media circus. We would do it, black and white, and we would allow them to see our results before we went on TV. And they still said no, Dave.
That's unbelievable. Huh. Yeah, I'm just astounded by the ignorance and stupidity sometimes behind these decisions. You've got all this information, Jeff, and all of a sudden, the idea that, and this was new, the idea that maybe Holmes not only was tricky and smart and got away with quite a bit for quite a while, but then there's the idea that maybe he even survived his hanging. And I mean, did you ever look at that and think, now that seems like a bit of a stretch to me?
Well, Dave, the part of that story, that component of my theory that always intrigued me the most, and it might be the way I think about historical issues, and I admit that I'm different than others, but the Holmes curse. Remember when I was on your show before, we explained to your audience how, the New York Times wrote about this. I didn't make this up, but anyone involved in his arrest, his trial, his incarceration, or his alleged execution that irritated him either suffered death or terrible misfortune. And the New York Times coined it the Holmes curse. And that part of the story, Dave, it reads like a Stephen King movie, and it always led me to believe, wait a minute, all the strange aspects of the execution and all the newspaper accounts, they admit it was strange. The burial that was just bizarre. And the cemetery and the archdiocese admits they were bizarre. And then that Holmes curse afterwards, I knew there was something fishy going on that we needed to look into.
Yeah, that is an intriguing aspect to this entire case. And for people that aren't familiar with this, most burial plots are 6, maybe 8 feet deep. But he requested to be buried at 8 feet deep, and to have a concrete slab poured over it. And the idea was so that his remains would remain untouched, and there would be no possible way for people to do exactly what you and your co-host did, disturbing the remains. Was it A, to hide something, or was it B, just so that he would be laid to rest and left alone? So that was an intriguing aspect. But you guys, you punched the ground. First of all, how hard was it for you to get permission to do this? I mean, I would have thought out of all of the requests you guys made, that would have been nearly impossible to get approved.
Well, and once again, the incredible people at History made it possible. And it took us almost a year, Dave, to get permission. We had to go to a judge. We had to get my family to agree. We had to get the Archdiocese in Philadelphia to agree. We had to get the cemetery to agree with our plan to exhume the body to determine if it was H.H. Holmes or not, or even to determine if there was a body there at all, because some of the newspaper accounts believed there was no body at all. And, we finally talked the judge into it, and he insisted that, the rules that he set forth that we had to do it by were amazing, and we had to return the body in the condition it was to the grave when we were finished with our DNA determination of identity. So, as I stated, it took us almost a year and a lot of money, and my hat's off to history for backing me up on, a theory that at some time must have been hard for them to decide whether they were going to say yes or no. And like I said, they were just incredible.
We need to take another break. We'll come back. We've got more to discuss with Jeff Mudgett. And what were the findings from that part of the investigation? We'll cover that and some of the revelations he has not talked about on the show when we return to Coast AM. Hey, how you doing, everybody? Thank you for tuning in and being a part of the show with me this evening. I've got a TV series out there right now for a major network that is currently filming, and they're seeking a few more stories. They're looking for people that have had terrifying paranormal encounters, and something that was a longer story, not just a quick little I saw something or a face in the mirror or something short. They want to know if you've had a long, ongoing, strange set of paranormal circumstances. And they're especially interested in people that believe they've been abducted. If you fit that genre, you can email me your story, a brief story and a brief paragraph about you with your contact information, and I'll forward it on to the production company. Email it to dave@darknessradio.com. dave@darknessradio.com. Jeff Mudgett, my guest for the remainder of this hour. Jeff, getting back into this for a few seconds before we go to break again. The idea to exhume the body was to test the belief that maybe Holmes did evade by bribing his way out of it, his own execution. You punched through 8-9 feet of dirt, found a grave that was empty, found that there was another one beneath it covered in concrete, got down there and found the remains of someone. Those bones were tested on the series, and DNA was returned to you that appears to be connected to you. Is that the truth of this, or was there something maybe I misunderstood in that episode?
Dave, great question. I know that History and their production team were working on the final episode, and particularly the conclusion, right up to the last minute. And throughout the entire summer, I think we extracted the bone powder from the skull in May, and it was sent to this famous laboratory in London to conduct they call it ancient DNA testing over 100 years. And I knew they were having trouble. It was had degraded and was largely unworkable for them. And I also know the scientists at the University of Pennsylvania, the anthropologists there, were having trouble with their own identification of the remains. So when I watched the final episode, I was as same as you were, Dave. I didn't know what to really expect. And so when the end of the show, it came up, the DNA and dental records conclusively establish a link to Jeff Mudgett. I hadn't seen any DNA. I hadn't seen any dental records. So the next day I requested from History those documents, and I received the DNA about 3 days ago. So I'm going over them now. I'm not a DNA expert, but I intend to present them at the talk in Chicago coming up that first week in October. Once I've had some experts help me interpret what they mean, but I'm sure the people at History did a great job and interpret them scientifically before they came up with that conclusion.
All right, let's take our final break for this hour. We'll come back and find out some of the new revelations. And again, if you're interested in seeing Jeff Mudgett live in Chicago the first weekend of October for the Chicago Paracon, then you can check out details and get tickets at darknessevents.com. I'll be emceeing the event all weekend long, so you get a chance to meet me. Tim Dennis from Beyond the Darkness and a myriad of other great paranormal speakers will be on hand, as well as Jeff Mudgett. So check it out at darknessevents.com and click on the Chicago Paracon banner for more information. We'll be back with more right after this. Sandra London will join me in the next 2 hours of the show. Her book, Good Little Soldiers, a memoir of true horror. It is a true crime story you need to hear to believe. We'll be doing that for the last 2 hours of tonight's show. Jeff Mudgett, our guest. Jeff, let's talk about some of the final revelations, some of the items that you haven't even spoken about before. I know that you said you had a few that you wanted to chat with us about tonight, and in the last 15 minutes or so here, let's try to cover some.
Yeah, at the end of the show, the season finale, do you recall, Dave, the scientists from the University of Penn mentioning that the skeleton only measured 5'4", when, the prison records established that Holmes was measured as 5'7.5". And, I'm still trying to come up with answers how that could have been possible. I'll tell you another thing. When I went to the University of Pennsylvania to inspect the remains for the first time, they were laid out on a table. And I got to tell you, Dave, they were very strange. Holmes had always been described as this very handsome, debonair, eloquent man who, fired his lawyers and defended himself in trial, and every paper in the country was there. And this skeleton looked, I don't know how else to describe it, but monkeyish. And, when the scientist on the final episode also mentioned that the bone structure was very thick for a man described as Holmes was supposed to have been, that's exactly the impression I had when I first saw them. And I'll give your listeners something very intimate. When I was there, I asked permission to hold the skull in my hand. And quite frankly, Dave, I had two ways to go on it. There, I was trying to decide whether I wanted to. I didn't know whether I wanted it to be Holmes or not. And we don't have enough time to get into the aspects of why that was. But as I was looking into the eyes and holding the skull in my hand, something remarkable happened. The skull actually flopped in my hand, Dave, and I didn't believe it myself. I moved it again. It flopped again. I called one of the anthropologists over, and I said, her name was Janet Munn. She's won awards all over the world. Janet, what's flopping in my hand? And she said, nothing, Jeff. You're imagining that. And I said, well, here, you hold the skull. She grabbed it, and it flopped in her hand. So both scientists rushed over, looked inside, and Dave, the brain was intact in the skull.
Wow. Really? I mean, with all of that degradation, the brain was still intact.
Yeah, and I asked them, how is that possible? And they said it wasn't possible. So there's so many, you know what, Dave? Every aspect of the Holmes stories have another inconsistency or mystery involved, and as the farther you go, the more crop up, and it's I'm almost I have a callus to them now, but I still want an answer from someone how, after 120 years, the brain was intact in the skull. And if the DNA had degraded, it obviously hadn't degraded in the brain inside the skull. So there's still questions to be answered, and if any of your listeners are geneticists or expert in biology and have an answer how that brain could have remained, perhaps it was because it was in that concrete sarcophagus that you described. It that concrete mummified the brain inside the skull. But I'd sure like to hear an educated guess about how it could have happened.
Especially with all the other tissue and connective tissue having completely disintegrated.
There was no other tissue whatsoever.
Right. That is very bizarre. Did Holmes's family, he had surviving family, and a lot of, pardon my association with this as being a family member of his, a lot of the multiple wives he had all seemed to have some working knowledge of just how dirty this guy was and realizing what he was doing. I mean, what were their thoughts about the murders afterwards? Did they know about it? Were any of them ever tried for guilt by association?
I think you bring up one of the most fascinating aspects of the story, and I asked the director of the show if we came back for a second season, could we run an episode or two emphasizing, his wives and mistresses, who I believe, as I think you are, moving towards, Dave, the history recounts these innocent women as having been unawares of what was going on around them. I don't believe that at all. Many were involved in his crimes. Many were his accomplices. There's a possibility that my great-great-grandmother actually visited Holmes while he was in prison and then made 3 visits to Chicago for reasons that have been yet to be determined, I tend to think they had to do with money, because there were 2 things that Holmes loved the most in the world, Dave: money and women, and money was first. And we still haven't determined what happened with all the money he made in prison doing the interviews and writing his memoirs.
The idea that he might have survived, and that was, I know, a big interest in this. And now that you found the remains, is there any chance, with the pull he had, were there any other family members that had ever gone missing that may have been used in that coffin so that the DNA would still match? I mean, not that he thought that well through, that someday they may do DNA testing, but, you know, here's a relative of mine that I can off pretty easily. Collect on that as well. And could that be why the DNA matches with you?
Well, you know, DNA is a game of probabilities, and when you have a matching profile, you basically are, as I understand it, Dave, and maybe you can help me with this, but you're basically saying the chances of what's in that grave not matching my DNA are 1 in 1 million or 1 in 10 million. They're so extreme that we're going to say that that's a lineal ascendancy, okay?
Mm-hmm.
When the DNA that I received came back, there was a partial profile, which you get into numbers which are much, much smaller as to the possibility that it wasn't my great-great-grandfather. And that's why right now I'm doing a lot of research. I'm asking for professional help so that when I go to Chicago, and hopefully you'll be there, I get to put the DNA test up on the screen and explain the numbers involved in whether or not, you know, that's conclusively Holmes. And I think it'll be a fascinating case to walk through. I know just learning about DNA has enlightened me to many misconceptions I had because of watching NCIS or similar television shows about what DNA can and cannot do.
What was it like for you after this 20-plus year journey of putting these pieces together to stand there and hold the skull of a killer and be truthfully, for the first time in your history, in his presence? What was that like?
Oh boy, that was, you remember the scene in Hamlet where...
Right, alas, poor Yorick?
Yeah.
Right.
It had a lot of those emotions were running through me. I was scared to death, but I'll tell you what caused more fear for me. When we were down to the concrete in the grave, Dave, and we were cracking the concrete, one of the representatives from the Archdiocese of Philadelphia came up to me, and they had approved the exhumation. They weren't happy about it. They believed that the man confessed his sins, whoever it was, and he had come to Jesus and that he deserved to rest in peace. And we convinced them and the judge that we had a possibility of proving that there was an innocent there who didn't belong to be there while not identified. Also, there was a possibility that we could determine direct evidence regarding Jack the Ripper. So we were approved. So we're there, we're cracking the concrete open, and as just before the skull came into view, this representative came over to me, Dave, and I'll give you his quote, which I'll never forget. He said, "My son, are you sure you know what you're doing? Because in my opinion, there's the potential for releasing something here that's not supposed to be let free again." And that scared the life out of me, that moment in time.
So you feel that there may be a supernatural element to this story that may have just
Dave,
been
we
released.
talked about that. Remember the first time when I explained when I went down into the murder castle, the post office basement, which was, close to the murder castle basement?
Right.
and how when we went down those steps, I didn't believe in the supernatural. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't, quite frankly, believe in God. And when I came back up those steps an hour later, I believed in all three. And I'm convinced there's an energy, Dave. I don't know if we'll ever see ghosts or prove voices in the paranormal. But I think one day, and I think 63rd and Walls may be where it's done, we're going to prove that there's an energy that continues after, quote unquote death. And I think, we came very close to it, exhuming this horrible, evil man, if that's who was there. And I'm pretty sure it probably is. But we came very close to doing something maybe we'll look back on as we shouldn't have done.
Well, I hope for your sake that you're safe. I did get an article, interesting article sent over to me from William, one of the listeners, and it's an article from 1984. Archaeologists find intact brains 7,000 years old, still containing DNA. Archaeologists in Florida found 2 human skulls estimated to be 7,000 years old, containing brains that were largely intact. The brains, which were discovered buried in peat at the bottom of a lake, have retained their original shape and structure, and a chemical analysis is reported to have shown that the tissue retains much of its original DNA, the thread-like molecules that contain the information controlling cell construction, function, and heredity.
Well, when we found the brain in the skull, I asked the University of Pennsylvania to preserve it and keep it, because I figured maybe 50 years from now, Dave, when technology has, increased, it increases so fast these days it's hard to keep track. But 50 years from now, we may be able to look at that brain, and if it is Holmes, determine, the definition of pure evil, because, you and I have had this talk before, that the man was pure evil. Right. And maybe knowing what that is, we can prevent it from happening in the future.
Fascinating stuff. Was it just boredom? Was it the thrill of the kill? Or was this man just absolutely flawed from birth on? That is the true aspect of true crime that always keeps us guessing. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on and revisiting with me 4 years later after our initial visit here on Coast to Coast. And again, I really enjoyed the series, and I wish you much success. And I hope that there's a part 2 to this series. Do you believe that there's enough left of your story to continue researching and maybe unearthing more information?
No, the excellent people at History have they've explained to me that there will not be a second season. That they're happy with the show as it ended.
All right. Well, I'm sure you're going to continue your journey, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the first weekend of October at the Chicago Paracon. Again, tickets are available at darknessevents.com.
The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, the man behind Jack the Ripper, a journey into madness and mayhem. We'll be talking about the real Jack the Ripper. Could it have been Sir Arthur Conan Doyle after all? Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Daniel Friedman, Dr. Daniel Friedman, is the co-author of The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, along with Eugene Friedman. Daniel, who started this whole thing first, you or Eugene?
Oh, the origins of this book came from me. It was actually during about 25 years ago when I was a medical student preparing for my boards. I'd be in the library and I would grab a journal off a shelf. And in a lot of them, I would find articles related to Arthur Conan Doyle, who I didn't know at the time, but he was a medical man. He was a physician, and he was one of my favorite authors of the time. And I wanted to read these articles quite honestly, when I started reading them, I thought they would be about his days as a medical student or as a physician making brilliant diagnoses on his patients, and how he would take those cases that he was dealing with and put them into his Sherlock Holmes stories. But these articles were nothing of the sort. I mean, each article was bizarre. And if I told you what they were about, it would blow your mind because they're crazy. One of them was in Science magazine, and it was about him being named the perpetrator of the Piltdown Man hoax. Do you remember the Piltdown hoax?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I actually have seen the Piltdown Man.
Right, and so
thing.
In other words, that skull with the jaw that was manufactured to fit the pieces together.
Part orangutan, wasn't it, and then part human? Exactly.
They actually named Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as the perpetrator of that hoax. And their evidence was incredible. And I was like, how the heck would this guy do this and then go to his grave and let these researchers become the embarrassment of the British Empire? I mean, it ruined England for years as far as the scientific community was concerned.
But there was a connection to the person that perpetrated the hoax, right? That was his idol, wasn't it?
Well, it wasn't his idol. He actually was getting revenge on Ray Lancaster because of the words he wrote about the spiritual movement. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was basically this figurehead in the spiritualist movement. And Ray Lancaster and a bunch of his friends basically said that Oliver Wendell Holmes and all these other spiritualists were crazy, and there was no evidence behind what they had. And, of course, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle thought this would be, according to the evidence of these other men, that he wanted to get revenge on this community of scientists, and voila, put together a skull with a jaw of an orangutan, and basically it was known as a hoax.
But that was so. I'm gonna push you on all of these things so that we stay both clear and then you can offer your best defense of your theory here, because we're talking about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as really sort of a lifetime. Maybe a lifetime trickster, somebody that was both writing these wonderful stories about somebody who could never be fooled in the fictional character of Sherlock Holmes, but then also at the same time, perhaps fooling the public at the same time. So, but I thought it was the guy that the hero kid from the school where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle attended as a kid, that was the guy that was connected to the Piltdown Man.
No, they're not related at all. The one he went after was Ray Lancaster, who was a well-known scientist at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, all right. So I'm a big believer in the idea that there is something about the mind of somebody as brilliant as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle as having a dark side that's just as brilliant, that may be something which even he knew in his psychopathy he had to keep private, but would still, as you say, kind of squish out sideways in these other articles that he would, there are things that he would reveal himself along the way. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, are the actual clues that, if you are right, that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was Jack the Ripper, that he left obvious clues that he thought or was challenging the public or Scotland Yard to figure out, while at the same time being celebrated as this national figure, obviously getting knighted as this wonderful author that everybody seemed to adore and respect.
Right. Well, his knighthood came from not from the writings he did per se on the Sherlock Holmes stories, but more for his work in South Africa and the Boer War, the Anglo-Boer War. But there were clues left behind at the scene, and they were really, they were detailed clues, very hard to decipher. And he actually has clues in the Sherlock Holmes stories that are just as equally hard. One I loved that I figured out was that at one of the murders, murder number 3, we were in Duffield Yard. Duffield Yard happens to be the place of murder 3, and it was also related in the Sherlock Holmes stories, where he says that he wants Watson to go to 3 Pinchin Lane to get a mongrel dog, basically, named Toby. Well, at that point in time, Dutfield moved his yard out. He wasn't in 1888, he was no longer in Dutfield Yard. He was actually at 5 Pinchin Lane. So Watson would have been in 1888 at 1 a.m. at the scene of the crime. He would have been in the new Dutfield Yard in Pinchin Lane.
Okay, so let's just say, given that little teaser about what's coming up ahead, let's talk about the somewhat fractured upbringing of Arthur Conan Doyle. That this was not necessarily a happy childhood. He was perhaps we might even say by British standards abandoned somewhat. That he had been emotionally abused. How would you describe the childhood of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle?
Yeah, it's exactly as you're saying. See, when Arthur Conan Doyle was born into a family that was completely dysfunctional. He had an abusive alcoholic father. His mother was basically one of the original cougars. She was having an affair with her medical student lodger, and it's actually speculated that she had at least 1 or 2 kids with this person. The mother, in order to protect Arthur, purportedly from the abuse of the father, shipped him off to a neighbor's house to go to school in Newington Academy. At that academy, Doyle was beaten up, basically whipped into shape by the one-eyed, pock-eyed monster, Mr. Wilson. After being abused as a little kid at age 5, he joined street gangs. So he's talking about a 5-year-old in street gangs, and he was actually named their champion. So he would be the one that they chose to beat up the other kids in the other gangs, in the rival gangs. So he was like the Sand Boys, and he would fight the other gangs. Then he was shipped off to Stonyhurst College, where he, according to other students, was beaten and disciplined more than any other kid in the school. And at about age 14, he was attacked by a professor there who said, "I'm going to kill you," and nothing ever came out of that. They had to hold back this prefect and basically get this guy out of the school. Doyle then moves on later to another school in Austria, and on his first day in the school, he stabs a kid and brought up on disciplinary action. He moves back to Edinburgh to medical school. He has no money. He has to take tests. He needs to find a new means of how to survive. He joins a whaling vessel, and on that boat, the first day on the boat, he actually picks a fight with the ship's steward and blackens the guy's eye. He goes on to join into a partnership with this a guy he knows from Edinburgh named George Budd, and on the first day of the partnership, he beats him up in the house, and the wife throws him out. He's always getting into fights. He's always belligerent. He's always in trouble. This guy, and he was abused. I mean, he had an emotional, traumatic upbringing.
So he was an abused child who's acting out as an adult, and
absolutely.
He has no money. He's keen to conflict, and he's so broke that this whaling vessel thing can't be underestimated. He goes on essentially as the ship's doctor, but when he comes back to try to get his medical license, he has to forge, and I think this part was really compelling in your book, The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, he has to forge his documents in order to be able to become a physician, in order to get board certified, because he was too young and he hadn't taken enough of the courses. Is that correct?
He actually broke into the bursar's office and changed his transcript. And we know that he was only in Birmingham, England, to do these clerkships in 1879, yet the dates on his transcript read 1877, 1878. He actually, another thing is in there, he actually forged his date of birth on the transcript, where he's really born in 1859, and his transcript is now changed to read as in 1858.
Because that's important, because he has to be able to qualify as a doctor at 25, and he's
Correct.
Not 25 yet.
Exactly. It gives him an extra, it takes 1 year off. Exactly. He can make more money quicker and sooner. Yeah, he's brilliant. He knows exactly what he wants to do and how to do it.
Yeah, but I think this is something for perhaps because we don't know enough, and you do, obviously, about medical procedures and the certification process in the 1800s in England. You can't become a doctor until you're 25, and a lot of what's being passed along in med schools is actually sort of a cooperative with these students going out and serving in these underneath other doctors and learning in practicums in the field, and he hasn't had enough of those. So that's why you're saying he had to make it appear as though he'd been out there a lot longer and that he was 25, because as a registered medical doctor, you make more money than you do if you're just somebody who people go to because they're desperate for somebody to put in stitches, but you're not actually a doctor.
Correct. Absolutely.
Okay.
You nailed it.
All right. But it's on that whaling ship, too, that he had to do some pretty horrible stuff.
Yeah, I mean, he actually, he's there as the ship's physician. And he actually let a guy die because he wanted to be out on the ice, bashing in the seals' heads and carving them up and dragging their carcasses back to the ship. And he actually was one of the better of the crew members who was able to do this. And he bragged about it, and he liked being able to do it, and he liked hanging out with the tough guys and going into the bars and picking fights. I mean, these are the things that he craved. And when he finished that voyage on the Hope, the captain of the ship actually told him, "I don't want you back next year as the doctor. I want you to come back as the whaler. You're amazing."
Right. And so that's something which maybe other people who are physicians wouldn't have wanted to do, is spend time cutting open seals. But he got used to gutting that. And maybe, as you argue, this became something that he started to miss.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, this he actually worked in the vivisection lab of Professor William Rutherford, and Rutherford was the role model behind Professor Challenger in The Lost World, and a little bit of Sherlock Holmes too. The why I'm bringing up the vivisection lab is because in that lab for Dr. Rutherford, Doyle had to do two things, and I'm going to relate one to another author's book. But what he had to do in this lab was actually cut the windpipe of the dog. He had to actually cut the dog in, abdomen open. He had to put cannulas into its liver for this procedure and drain out the gallbladder. Actually, and if you take that procedure down when you're cutting the windpipe and opening the abdomen and taking samples of the liver, it's exactly what happened at murder number 4 of the Jack the Ripper crimes. And the person that he worked for, Dr. Rutherford, demanded a special type of paper made by Peary and Son out of Aberdeen, Scotland, which is actually one of the things that Patricia Cromwell was looking for. She said that the killer of Jack the Ripper, Jack the Ripper had to have used that paper. So her killer, the identity would be someone who would use that artist-grade paper, which Doyle had access to and he used.
So this is interesting. So already some of what we always thought we understood about Jack the Ripper, the proposal that he had medical experience. Whether or not he was a full doctor, people didn't know, and there are other doctors who have been implicated in the rogues gallery of Jack the Ripper suspects over the years. I think what I really had underestimated until I was reading The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, and again, we're talking with Dr. Daniel Friedman, who is the co-author of the book, is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was much more immersed in the darker arts of medicine than the healing arts of medicine.
Right, and as a physician, obviously, he failed. He couldn't grow a practice, and then he tried his hand in ophthalmology, and he failed in that too. And he said, later on, he said, my waiting room and my consulting rooms were basically the same room. They were just waiting rooms. I never had patients.
But I think this is also that it seems like he had a very poor bedside manner.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you can't grow a practice, there's obviously something wrong with the way you relate to people, and
right.
I really believe that's the reason why he couldn't grow this practice. He just couldn't relate to them. He couldn't be on their wavelength. And
that's a characteristic that's often said of Sherlock Holmes. So I want to get back to this. So again, we're talking about whether or not Jack the Ripper was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous author of the Sherlock Holmes series. Some of the characteristics that he gives Holmes may in fact have been the characteristics of Jack the Ripper. We'll get into that. The obsession with the perfect crime, for example. And then we'll have to talk about the Dear Boss letter and a couple of the works of Sherlock Holmes as well next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, a journey into madness and mayhem. Daniel Friedman is one of the co-authors of the book. We're talking to him about his evidence, what he believes has been staring at us from hell letters, in so many clues that were left by a guy who knew all about clues, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, that he was Jack the Ripper. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. It's a journey into madness and mayhem. I'm going to digress for 1 second because I thought, well, what did I get wrong in that previous conversation? So, Daniel, let me clear this up. When you were talking about Charles Waterton, and that he had been the dauntless one at the school where Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had attended. That one of the reasons why this kid had become so famous, he was a legendary student, kind of the best boy of all time.
Yeah, the naturalist. Yeah, he actually discovered curare and its effects and made actually the first artificial respirator.
Yeah, and so that was interesting that this guy, Charles Waterton, was also kind of a hoaxer. And that
absolutely.
Yeah, and I wondered, so that's what I was, when I said, well, he was kind of an idol of him.
Oh, I see. Now I understand where the reference is coming from. Sure, he did the Red Howler Monkey. Where he basically he was charged this exorbitant amount of money for bringing stuff back in from South America back to Europe. So he actually made a mockery of the guy who charged him and basically configured this Red Howler Monkey to look like the missing link type of thing.
Right.
And of course, Doyle would later, with the Piltdown Man hoax, as you're alluding to, do one better and make him like the real mixing link.
And I think that was what. So I thought that was why it was so interesting. Was that I thought you had made that connection in the book? Is that here he was, as a boy, he saw how everybody was enamored with this guy who was kind of also living sort of this dual life. He was making all of these amazing medical achievements, as you mentioned, the curare and the
artificial respirator.
And the artificial respirator. But at the same time, he had this devilish streak where he liked to sort of tweak the nose of the establishment, and he had created the first missing link hoax, and that led to the Piltdown Man. And I thought, wow, that connection.
Oh,
25.
Exactly, you're right on the money.
Yeah, but that's really because I think that speaks directly to this fracture inside of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. That if you're right, he even had a model for this, where you could be very respectable and everybody loves you, but behind the scenes, you could be your very own Moriarty. You could be that person who's pulling the strings and making other people believe things that you want them to believe.
Yes, and he actually did that with a lot of his friends. Actually, in the murder club he was in, it's called Adler Society, he brought people to seances with him to show them how they were actually real. And the people in the club were saying, "You're like a 4-year-old. This is obviously fake. Don't you see it? They're using phosphorus to make his chin light up, just like you wrote about 10 years ago in The Hound of the Baskerville. How are you being taken by this?" But he said,
so interesting.
That's the real deal. So he actually lost a lot of friends that way. And one of his closest friends, James Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, told him, "Listen, you and I are great friends. We play on the cricket field together. But do not tell me to believe in spiritualism. If you do, you and I, our friendship is over." So he had to find a balance between what he believed or who he was going to bring into his ideas, and he walked a fine line all the time.
Yeah, and not just spiritualism. I mean, the fairies and all of that other stuff.
He defended the two teenage girls with the fairies.
The folks.
He basically just took a coloring book and took pictures of the fairies. And the thing about that is, Arthur Conan Doyle, before he was known as the writer of Sherlock Holmes, he had his own column in the British Journal of Photography in the early 1880s. You're talking about like 8 years before Sherlock Holmes came out. So when the fairies were being shown to the world in the 1820s, he was an expert photographer. He knew how to fake a photograph. So he should have known, or he did know, that these were fake, and he was just trying to tell the world, no, this world that he lives in, this magical thinking world, is real. As a matter of fact, his father, Arthur Conan Doyle's father, and a lot of believed in fairies and that he could talk to birds and he could see them, and it's something that his son actually believed in too, and it's this father-son relationship that really was what got me going on the origin of Jack the Ripper, actually. Because what happened was, when I came across his medical school thesis, and we were talking about you had to write a thesis to become a doctor at age 25.
Right.
So when he was approaching that age, he wrote a thesis for med school on the final phases and stages of syphilis, and I read about this in JAMA. I called Edinburgh Medical School. I said, "Can I get a copy of his thesis?" They sent it over. It's 130 pages. The first thing I noticed were some of the dates that he quotes in the beginning of the thesis are only 2 weeks later he's submitting it. So he's quoting articles that were only 2 weeks old. So he wrote this thing in about 2 to 3 weeks. You're talking about a PhD thesis, basically. It's almost unheard of. I mean, I couldn't do it, which is why I was so impressed. But some of the information contained inside was what really got me going, what was going on with his mind. Because the first thing was he writes very anecdotally, like, you're sitting at a table with a man who's squinting reading the newspaper. And I'm going, what is he talking about? Like, does he know someone with syphilis that he would be sitting at the table with the guy? And then he starts really describing this one obscure sign of syphilis, which is the loss of a knee-jerk reflex, called the Westfield sign. And he goes on and on about this. And then at the end of his thesis, he writes about the treatments, because, that's how you have to do, like, this breakdown of how you treat and how you diagnose. And at the end, he actually says, the treatment of syphilis is amyl nitrate, up to you start with 1 millum. And he says, I myself have taken up to 40 without any ill effect. So the first thing that caught me was, why is a guy without syphilis taking toxic doses of
amyl nitrate
that only is known to treat syphilis? I mean, did he think he had it when he was 25 years old? Which is what got me going into doing all this research about what was going on in his life and who is this anecdote about? Like, why is he sitting at a table with someone?
Okay, wait. So let me back up for a minute. So amyl nitrate, isn't that what today we call poppers? And isn't it connected to the sex drug?
Yeah, exactly. Right? It's like nitroglycerin. It actually dilates your blood vessels, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it makes you frenetic, and people take poppers and then they go dancing and then have, the theory is that you have this uninhibited wild animal-like sex on amyl nitrate. I mean, that sounds like what was happening with some of the victims later on with Jack the Ripper. I mean,
remember, none of the Ripper victims were raped. There was
no, I don't mean that, but I mean in terms of the frenzy of the cutting and the whatever. I mean, that's so interesting to me that you brought up. I didn't make that connection with amyl nitrate until just now.
But he was taking very high doses, and he actually says the first thing you get is a headache. So he actually knew.
Yeah.
The side effect profile. This guy was really, you're talking, this is the medicine he's taking.
He's hopped up on poppers.
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
Come on.
Right. And of course, and why would you want to do this if you're writing about it in your thesis and you're confessing to your professors that you're taking such a medicine for this condition, which kind of was like, what is he doing here?
What's he admitting to? Yeah.
And then what happened next was I actually ordered this book called The Doyle Diary, which I thought was going to be about Arthur Conan Doyle, because who else would be the Doyle Diary? It actually happened to be about his father, who was an artist.
That's right.
But
they published after his, And
all of a sudden you find out that his father was incarcerated in a mental hospital for presumptive alcoholism at age 42. And it's like, and he died there years later. He never escaped. He was made a prisoner, actually. And I actually contacted the mental hospitals that he was an inmate at, and I asked for his medical records. They sent them to me, and I went over them. And the thing that really shot out at me and said, wow, this is something of importance, is that the only physical finding that they had on him on admission to Montrose Hospital was that he had this absent knee-jerk reflex.
Oh, he had syphilis.
And Doyle's thesis, he actually spends an awful amount of time talking about it, saying if you have if you have Westphal sign, you have syphilis until proven otherwise. And I made that connection, like he is thinking that his father, that anecdotal patient of his that's sitting at the table with him reading the paper and squinting, is his father.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I read another article that happened right after this thesis paper, which is on the Contagious Diseases Act, and it's written by Arthur Conan Doyle. And he says that women of the night are ruining the taverns of the area. They should be locked up and incarcerated into lock hospitals, and invasive gynecological examinations should be performed on them until they are deemed to be clear of infectious disease. And he writes this long article in the Portsmouth News, and a week later, another physician writes back and says, Arthur Conan Doyle is a liar. His information is completely all lies, and he has to retract his statement, and he did. So I knew there was a connection that syphilis and prostitutes and getting them off the streets and this connection to his father is now here. But what got me is I also knew that he also was taking the medicine on himself, and I went back and read about what he had as a child. That's when I started doing all this research on his early life, and I realized that he had, at a very young age, at age 10, he had neuralgia, like this pain in his jaw, and he actually was getting electric shock therapy when he was a teenager for it. And later, when he was doing that, we were talking about the assistant clerkships to get your degree in medicine.
Yeah.
And when one of his clerkships was in Birmingham, and he was taking gelsemium, and he actually overdosed on it, and two of the assistants that he was working with actually had to save his life because he almost died. Later on, he's using chemicals from the darkroom to treat a rash that looks like psoriasis. And of course, as a physician, and even you sounds like you would know too. You know everything.
No.
That rash of syphilis is actually, it mimics the rash of psoriasis.
Oh, interesting.
And there were a lot of these interconnections where, did he think at this point in time when he was 25 years old that he really had syphilis, and he had it from hereditary factors from his father? And of course, there's a story that he wrote called The Third Generation. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote this, I think in the early 1890s, maybe even the 1880s, where he talks about a grandfather passing it down to his son, who syphilis, this is, who passes it down genetically to his grandson, and the grandson kills himself because he knows he has it. And I said, "Oh, this could be this could be what's upsetting this kid at this point. He's 25. He's he just became a doctor, and all doctors think whatever disease you read about, you have." And I thought maybe he thought he had it too.
All right, but there's another explanation though too, right? Which is that here he was. His childhood had been ruined. He'd been abused. He had been left at boarding schools for, as you point out, 6 weeks over Christmas, even though he wasn't a foreign student. He was like him and all of these other foreign students. He's left at these boarding schools because his mother is having she's having a robust sexual life with a younger lover. Mm-hmm. Because the marriage broke down because his father had become a self-medicating alcoholic and had very likely then syphilis. And so if he got syphilis from prostitutes, which then ruined his life and broke up his family, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle could easily be associating the fact that he had a miserable life up until this point, and it all goes back to the fault of the prostitutes for passing along syphilis. So if they hadn't given his father syphilis, then his parents would have stayed together, and he wouldn't have had such a miserable upbringing. His father wouldn't have been so abusive. It all would have been better.
Exactly. And
that makes sense.
Why those prostitutes that were killed by Jack the Ripper were not the young girls of like 16 to 25 that you would probably think of would be the victims. They were all in their 40s, 42 to 47 years old.
Right.
They would have been the ones that would have been attracted to Charles Doyle back in his younger days. So,
but they were also about the age of his mother. So
they were the age of his mother at the time. You are correct. They were the exact age of the mother.
He gets a twofer. He's killing the prostitutes, and he's acting out against his mother, who kept abandoning him at these schools where she could have brought him home for the holidays, but she was too busy with her robust sex life. It kind of all comes together. I mean, it's really kind of, if you were ever looking for a motivation for Jack the Ripper, that's pretty boilerplate.
Right, exactly.
Right there. So, all right. So, but let's get into some of the where some and I don't mean to treat it like it's esoterica. It's not. You have uncovered some missing details in both the life of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Jack the Ripper. Whether or not these are two in the same, let's get down to it. Let's talk about some of the really obvious clues that most people know who follow Jack the Ripper, that like the From Hell letter or Dear Boss or some of the other ways in which he had, contacted the authorities and seemed to be tweaking their nose, much in the same way that the Piltdown Man or the Howler Monkey hoax, that these were all ways of sort of saying, you guys think you're so smart, but you're not.
Right, exactly. He was playing with them. I mean, he was playing with the Central News Agency and the police. Some of
with the establishment, with the whole establishment.
Right, and we know, some people say these weren't letters written by Jack the Ripper, but obviously some were. One of them had a piece of the victim's kidney that was mailed back to the pathologist, Openshaw. Right. So we know that letter was written by Jack the Ripper, so it can't be said that he didn't. It actually was a perfect match. He said, I ate the victim's kidney, and here it is in a box.
Right, yeah. All right, so give me some of the clues that you think indicate Jack the Ripper is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Sure. I mean, before I get to the letters, I would probably go more to like what was left behind at the crime scene.
Okay.
And I'm just going to do a little bit of just so your audience knows. Arthur Conan Doyle in 1887 became a Freemason. This is a very prestigious organization. They actually have about 3 million members now, and they are a brotherhood that does charity and good deeds. Obviously, even though in my profession, I'm a physician, and as Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes says, when a doctor does go wrong, he's the first of criminals. He has nerve and he has knowledge. It doesn't mean that all doctors are bad. It's the same thing here. So he's a Freemason. Doyle is a Freemason. The majority, 99% of Freemasons are great, and they do charitable deeds. In fact, Doyle's lodge, Phoenix Lodge 257, was in the midst of raising funds for the local hospital. So in 1887, Doyle became a Freemason, and he became a third degree within about 2 months. When he got his third degree apron, he actually resigned. Basically, he didn't show up to any of the lodge meetings. He didn't participate anymore. He didn't raise money for the hospital. And then he actually demitted from the organization, which is almost unheard of, 2 years later. I've had many Masons say there's no way no one ever demits from the Masons, and they looked it up, and his records show that he did in 1889. So we're going to need this for the clue basis. So when you become a third degree, they do a play. Back in the day, I don't know if they do this now, they probably don't, but back in the 1880s, they do a play where they reenact the death of King Solomon's master architect, Hiram Abiff. And the first guy, Jubala, basically hits the master mason across the neck. So we call that, and in the Masons they had a penal sign. It's called the punishment signs, and it was your hand basically across your neck. And then penal sign number 2 is your left hand on your left breast. And in the play they say that my intestines are placed over my shoulder in the valley of Jehoshaphat. And in the third act that was committed against the master mason was he was hit in the head with a gavel. So there's the blow to the head. So we have to go back to the Ripper clues. In murder number 1, that of Marianne Nichols, she was basically gutted. Her intestines were ripped open, her intestines were exposed, and that she had a deep neck wound. But the thing about that is that's not what the police saw. When the police arrived at the crime scene, she only had her neck wound exposed. The Ripper somehow or for some reason buttoned up her dress again and it wasn't seen until the victim got to the mortuary that her intestines had been basically exposed and her abdomen ripped open. So
okay,
if you
this would be a good time to pause. So when we continue with Dr. Daniel Friedman, he's going to talk about the clues, the obvious clues left behind by Jack the Ripper, which indicate that it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And then we'll get to the letters. And then we'll get to your calls for him, too, to try to make the case, the strange case of Dr. Doyle, a journey into madness and mayhem on Coast to Coast AM. In for George Norrie, this is Ian Punnett. Well, I got to tell you a little bit about that song. You can buy the whole album if you want. Swallowthemusic.com is the website. You'll find it. But shout out to Gerald Crandall, who's a longtime coastie on Coast to Coast AM. His son is a verifiable rock star. And he's the leader of that band, Swallows. That song is pretty cool because it's all about what may or may not have been the first victim of Jack the Ripper, Francis Coles, who was murdered on Friday, February 13th, 1891. There was a railway arch that was right by Swallow Gardens near Whitechapel, and the area, there was a couple of, the Crown and the Seven Stars was a popular pub, and the guy who witnessed the murder, the frenzied murder, was standing just outside the Crown and Seven Stars. He watched the entire thing. He wanted to intercede on the woman's behalf, but instead, as the frenzy continued, he just faded into the shadow of the doorway of the Seven Stars and watched. And that's what that song's about. Cool band. Nice work. Again, thanks for bringing it to my attention, Michael Pfeiffer. This the place where you can find it. The band is called Swallows, and it's swallowsthemusic.com. So as you go to this subject, Jack the Ripper and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you will notice that other people in the past have proposed this interconnection, right? Other authors have attempted to draw together the clues that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was known for exposing as Sherlock Holmes, and perhaps his psychological need as Moriarty, the world's, most sinister criminal, to create the perfect crime at the same time. Expose one, but be the other in real life. Be Sherlock Holmes in fiction, but actually be living the life of Moriarty. That is perhaps what made those stories and that rivalry within the stories a glimpse into the psychology of the author himself, Dr. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And we'll get to his strange case next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. We'll give you the numbers that you need to join the conversation coming up later on, and then we'll go to open lines later on tonight. You can take us anywhere you want to go. It's Friday night on Coast to Coast. Coming up tomorrow night, I'll be on, and we'll talk in the first hour with the man responsible for another great expose. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend you look at the Sons of Sam, which is a Netflix series which does as much as one can do to prove that, in fact, Maury Terry was right. The investigative journalist who went to his death believing that there were more than one killers. And David Berkowitz was not the only son of Sam, and we'll talk to that man coming up tomorrow, first hour, on Coast to Coast. Great Netflix series. Awesome ending. The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, Daniel Friedman. We were just talking about the fact that that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a Mason, and as a Mason, as a member of a secret society, they have all sorts of weird little secret codes, little hand gestures and stuff. The idea of the Masonic connection to Jack the Ripper, that's been around for a while, and in fact, it appears in a couple movies where a Masonic ring was being worn by somebody who let somebody else go and all of that. So, but you're making the case that even the bodies themselves indicate the oath process that one goes through.
Absolutely, it's the ritual they do, and these are the penal signs that are basically symbolic of that ritual. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be the Napoleon of crime, if you're going to be the Moriarty of crime over here, you got to be able to go to a crime scene and make it look like it's just a regular run-of-the-mill murder, but you have to be able to arrange it and orchestrate it so perfectly that you're leaving a clue behind that no one's going to find out because you're the best. You're toying with law enforcement, and that's exactly what this criminal mastermind did. And he walked down nothing without anybody even thinking twice about what he was doing. I mean, so we did murder number one where it was really at the crime scene. We only saw the neck wound, which is penal sign number one. It's what they did, what Jubala did to the Master Mason. And a murder site number two, which was done 9 days later, Ann Chapman, she had been, her neck slashed and she had her abdomen ripped open. But in her case, her intestines were placed over her left shoulder, which is part of the ritual. Your intestines go to the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And her left hand was purposely placed on her left breast. And we know this because the Ripper dipped the backside of her hand in her own blood and placed it that way. So we know he left it there for the police to find. And they didn't discover they didn't understand the real meaning of what this criminal mastermind did. Murder number three, he got to the neck wound, but obviously someone was coming out of the social club that he was at. He was in Dutfield Yard, which we actually said would be, at this point, Dutfield Yard would have been relocated to 5 Pinchin Lane, which is actually in the second Sherlock Holmes tale, where Watson is in September of 1888 when the murders are going on. He's there at 1 a.m. picking up a dog, and that's another clue that he left behind in his own writings. So he actually fled the scene, the Ripper, and went the same night to Mitre Square, which is where he found his fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes, and in this play, the last and the final wound is a head wound. And the first two victims, or actually first three victims, really didn't have any facial lacerations performed. Their noses were kept intact and eyelids intact, but not on this fourth one. On the fourth one, we see facial mutilations were done. The ear was carved. There were under the eyelids there were markings placed. So he wanted to show you that I'm doing something that required a facial or head injury, which would go along with penal sign number 3. So and as he leaves, he says, "I'm not really done yet. Let me just go to a wall and kind of write a message on it," where he uses some words that some people believe are actually Masonic in origin. And when Commissioner Charles Warren, who's actually the head historian for the Freemasons, sees it, he says, "I want this washed off the walls immediately, not photographed." And the other people involved, because that's in Goulston Street, that's part of Scotland Yard's jurisdiction. Mitre Square was part of the City of London's, so they had no right to tell Commissioner Warren not to wash it off, and they did. They washed it off the wall without a photograph, and then that was the last of the Masonic clues there.
But what does it say? What did they wash off?
I think it said the Jews are not to be blamed for nothing. It was some type of, but they used the word Jews, and he spelled it Juwes, which is supposed to be the three ruffians who killed Hiram Abiff, Jubalo, and Jubellum. It's supposed to represent their names.
Huh. Okay.
So it's actually another Masonic reference. And actually that was a whole big inquest. It was actually in court to figure out what spelling was really used. Was it Jews, as in the Jews? Because Warren said he was getting rid of it for an anti-Semitic, didn't want anti-Semitic attacks to occur. But everybody said that's the case. It wasn't spelled that way. It was, and the person said, I was there. I wrote it in my book, and two people did, and it was Juwes. So Warren, who is the commissioner of police, and also the historian for the Freemasons. He actually started the Grand Lodge's library. He should have known and I'm sure he did know what that word meant.
That was a Masonic reference. Very
Right.
interesting. All right,
And there were things left behind at the murder sites that were clues too. I mean,
like.
and they're symbolic. So you had the symbolism of the murders, how they were placed to begin with, but then on murder number 4, he plants a thimble next to the victim's finger, but not on it, but near it. And it's kind of funny because I mentioned before that J.M. Barrie, who wrote Peter Pan, was a really close friend with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. They played cricket together at this time, and they wrote a play together, Jane Annie. But a thimble in Peter Pan is symbolic of a kiss. It's actually what Wendy gives to Peter. And leaving the thimble off the finger may have represented infidelity, which is what the MO is what made the Ripper tick. And again, he also left handkerchiefs at each and every scene. And the symbol in the Shakespearean play Othello, in which Iago takes a handkerchief and manipulates it into representing infidelity, could be the logic behind why he left handkerchiefs. So you have these handkerchiefs and thimbles being left behind, and the way the bodies were positioned. So there were a lot of symbolic actions left by the Ripper purposely, and of course, one of the other things that you mentioned before with the rings were taken off the victim's fingers. And, of course, a wedding ring represents fidelity. So taking them off their fingers, it would indicate infidelity by these women. So
or it could represent you don't have the right to wear this ring because you're a prostitute.
Or if he's acting out on his mother, he could say, you have no right to wear this ring because you were unfaithful to Dad.
You were unfaithful to Dad.
Right,
yeah.
You were cheating on him. So again, and Dad went out with prostitutes, and look what it did to me. You gave me something that destroyed my life, or will eventually destroy my life.
Yeah, that's such an interesting concept. If Sir Arthur Conan Doyle believed that he had genetically inherited syphilis because he had psoriasis.
And also the neuralgia that he was plagued with since he was 10 years old, and nothing made it go away, not even overdosing on gelsemium or taking overdoses of amyl nitrate, or the rash that he had didn't go away when he put on the medicines from his chemical lab. Yes, he had multiple things that he could not get rid of, and they were all part of the early stages of syphilis.
But you know what's interesting about that? I read somewhere, I don't know, you may have come across this, that at one point in the population, like syphilis was like in 40% of the population. It was everywhere.
It was everywhere. It was. It was everywhere, and you didn't even know you had it. And that's why, Doyle's article where he writes that I want these women locked up and incarcerated for months on end and have invasive gynecological exams done to them. It's really telling him what's on his mind. And just at this point in time, when he's writing these articles and he's writing his thesis, he did not advertise himself as a general practitioner, and he was not an ophthalmologist at the time. He was actually acting more as a midwife. And that's what his card would read. And a midwife at that time meant really just being an OBGYN.
Sure.
And it's funny because he actually confessed to his son Adrian Doyle that his theory was that the Ripper was a midwife. So he's not giving a bad clue to his son. He's actually telling him, but midwife doesn't mean what you think it means. It's not a woman. It's a doctor. It's a doctor who doubles as an OBGYN.
All right, so let's talk about the letters. What do we see? What clues were staring at us in what we presume to be the authentic Jack the Ripper letters, which could indicate that it was actually I don't know why I'm having such trouble saying Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult. The first thing is that I'm going to steal. I'm going to steal from the greatest. I'm actually going to steal from Arthur Conan Doyle, who actually wrote an article to the Portsmouth News about how he would have gone about tracking down Jack the Ripper by using the Dear Boss letter. Now, it's funny, just so you know, the letter he's talking about, the Dear Boss letter, actually went missing right at the same time that Arthur Conan Doyle actually saw this letter in real life at the Black Museum of Scotland Yard. He probably took it home with him. because it was returned 100 years later by, obviously he had something arranged with some legal place in
a
Canada.
barrister.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Then they had to come back, but he basically analyzes the letter, giving clues out. But when you analyze the clues really carefully, he's just telling you, it's me. He actually starts the letter by telling people that it's written in a red ink and a very clerkly hand on high-quality paper. And it was written by a man who knew American language or Americanisms. So, and he talks about like these words like "dear boss." Like no Englishman would ever write the word "dear boss." It doesn't happen in a letter. And of course, the letter is. That means the fact that he knew the quality of the paper means that he actually had in his hand the authentic one, which people thought he saw a facsimile, but it wasn't. If he's talking about the quality of paper, he knows what it is. And that was one of the things that got me going was, in the beginning I mentioned, Patricia Cromwell's book says, the Ripper had access to this high-quality artist-grade paper called Perry paper. And Doyle, being from an artistic family, would have probably had that paper too, but that's kind of like an empty theory. I mean, anybody can say that, but he was working in the vivisection lab of William Rutherford, and in Rutherford's textbook of histology, he actually writes on page 9 that my students have to use the antique, not too highly glazed paper from the Peary Paper and Son. He actually names it, which means if Doyle is his student and Doyle is his lab assistant, that means Doyle would have had to be using that paper too. So
and
he would have put that connection that Patricia Cromwell really wanted. She said, if you can't put the connection of that paper, Perry paper, to the Rippers, the person you think it is, it's not it. So I made that connection right away, just by reading the textbook of his professor.
Well, that's interesting because, and as you point out, in his lineage, he comes from a family of artists and caricaturists, and the idea that paper would not only have been everywhere in his father's house growing up, presumably his own house growing up, and that having access, because his father was an artist at one point, and so this is like almost nostalgic kind of paper. It's kind of like how I feel about a certain bond that I used to use when I was typing, and I don't use that bond anymore, but every time I see it, I come back to that place where I remember this as the typing paper of choice that I used to use.
Right, again, it also makes a connection back to his mother and father's relationship again, because that's the paper that was in his house. That was the one that was in the grandfather's house. I mean, his grandfather was like the rock star of the time, like noted caricaturist. He had an alias that and again, this is a hoaxer family. The grandfather went by the initials HB. He didn't tell anybody who he was, and he was poking fun at, the members of Parliament in the papers. But you couldn't stop him because you didn't know who he was. He was only initials. And he only confessed years later to, like, Robert Peel that he was, HB.
He was the caricaturist that had been lampooning established society, just like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was doing in his own sick way as Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, we only did it in the Sherlock Holmes stories. In that Sign of the Four, the second book, he actually says to Watson, "I'd rather have a mongrel dog than the entire Scotland Yard." I mean, that's pretty bold. If I were a member of Scotland Yard reading that, I would be a little bit upset.
Well, even the characterization of Lestrade as being this, essentially a functional idiot, and it only helped to heighten the mystique around Holmes. But if that's true and I tell you what I'll do, I'm going to come to the bottom of the hour here, and I don't want to miss it. I want to go back to one other point, and I'll finish this one and then go back to another one, and then we'll do a break, we'll give the numbers, and we'll get more of it in on what was in the letters. But, Daniel, you had mentioned before about the fairies, the fact that it was so odd that here's a guy who was already an expert in photography. Why would he be fooled by children who were concocting, these obviously hoax photographs that they were taking of fairies? And why would he be so fooled by spiritualism when at the same time he was writing about some of the tricks in his own writing? And I wonder whether that's an indication of again, of his sociopathy, of his narcissism, that he's the only one smart enough to do that. And if he wasn't doing it, it must be real.
Exactly, and that is part of it. That's part of his personality disorder. I mean,
yeah.
These kids actually said, I would have confessed earlier, but the fact is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle took our side, made it so that I couldn't confess to what we were doing. And,
right.
And they let it go for, I think she confessed on, it was Oprah or something, that she confessed that she just had the colored cutouts and she was photographing them. But she said if it wasn't for Arthur Conan Doyle believing in us, we would have just confessed right out of there. But he came down to us and he spoke to us and he said we were incredible with what we did.
All right. That's our music in the background. So we're playing you off for just a moment, and we'll come back. We'll give the numbers. You two can join in the conversation as we're talking about the strange case of Dr. Doyle. Was he Jack the Ripper? Daniel Friedman continues next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. There you go. It's applicable no matter who it is that was Jack the Ripper. Definitely a psycho killer. Now, could it have been Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? And what were the clues that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was leaving behind in those letters? We'll talk about that coming up on Coast to Coast AM. Also, first hour tomorrow night, as we mentioned, it's kind of an interesting twofer. The Son of Sam murders in the first hour with Joshua Zeman, who has been responsible for some of the most critically acclaimed true crime docs, like the film Cropsey, if you ever saw it. Ooh, that's chilling. And then he also worked on the docuseries The Killing Season and Murder Mountain. He's in the first hour talking about this great Netflix series about David Berkowitz. But then Jonathan Meberg, I believe it's pronounced, who has been studying birds. And when I say that the subject tomorrow night is birds, don't be fooled. We're not going to be talking about just your run-of-the-mill birds that are sitting on the branches outside of your house, as lovely as they are in the treetops where I live, but it also pertains to the long history, the prehistoric history of those birds. How many of them get tied to prehistory today? His fascination with island birds in particular, the deep history of the living world, the complexities and wonders of birds, coming up tomorrow night as our main guest on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Well, Daniel Friedman, no surprise, we're getting great calls for you on this subject. Then we'll go to open lines coming up on Coast to Coast AM. But as Donna puts up more, let's talk a little bit more about the letters, because that has become the focus so much of Ripperology. People who are looking at the clues that are in the bona fide Jack the Ripper letters. What are the clues there that it could have been Sir Arthur Conan Doyle?
Sure. Now, I'm just going to go back to that Dear Boss letter we were talking about.
Yep.
Just the fact that he starts off the letter with
an Americanism like that.
Right, exactly. Would have Dr. Doyle, when he was just, and I'm calling Dr. because he wasn't Sir at the time, when he was just actually he was only a Mr., he was a medical student, he worked for Reginald Hoare in Birmingham, and he actually would write to him when he left, Dear Boss. And that was the salutation he gave to his mentor. And in some of the stories that he wrote pre-Jack the Ripper, he, from A Night Among the Nihilists, he actually uses Dear Boss in that story. So it's something that he was very accustomed to those words, and he knew Americanisms. He wrote The American's Tale in 1880, I think 1 or 2, and The Study in Scarlet, the whole part about the middle section about the Mormons, is all written as if he's like Bret Hart. I mean, he writes all of Americanisms of the Midwest. So he was a master of Americanism. So what they say about being an American, you didn't have to be an American. You could be Doyle. He could write in that type of vernacular.
Well, I mean, he wrote the character of Irene Adler, and she was an American.
She was American, born in New Jersey, right? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. So, and that being the love interest or so to speak.
What they say,
anyway,
yeah, exactly.
whatever, however that works. All right,
and the other one I loved it from Hell Letter that was written later on to Mr. Lusk, and that's a real one. And one little clue in there, again, the master of orchestration, is that the letters that were really written by the Ripper have this nursery rhyme catchphrase in it. Catch me if you can. Like in some of them, it's catch me when you can. So you think you can catch me now? It's always this little that word "catch me" is in all the authentic Ripper letters. It's in that From Hell one too. And one thing I noticed, if you read it, the letter, he purposely spells words incorrectly, but weirdly. Like if you were from a foreign country, which he was trying to make himself out to in this one,
right?
Like you were from like Eastern Europe, let's say, you may spell knife N-I-F-E. But he doesn't. He spells it with the K, the silent K, K-N-I-F, leaves out the E. You would never write it like that.
Yeah, and that was part of what led to the belief that it must be a foreigner because a good Britishman would never do this, and that it must have been that guy from Poland that they were looking at for a while, and then it must be Jews or whatever.
Yeah, I mean that guy. I mean, first of all, I don't know. When you talk about the Ripper and the murders, I mean, one thing you have to remember is these women didn't scream. No one heard them scream. One of them was outside of a window, right of people who were basically awake. And no screams were heard, and abdomen was cut up. So whoever did it had to have enough power and strength to really subdue them. Yeah. These are women. These are women of the what we call the unfortunate class. They basically lived day to day. They went out. They sold their bodies. They got some money. They went back to a doss house and they lived. They fought. Like one woman, a week before she died, was in a bar fight where she got facial wounds and chest wounds because she was arguing over a bar of soap. Right. A guy who's 100 pounds, she would have attacked or did her best to make some noise. Not one of those 4 Ripper victims made any sound at all. I mean, that shows you the power behind the person. And Arthur Conan Doyle, he was one powerhouse. A boxer, sealer, whaler. He could climb up water pipes. I mean, the guy was an animal. I mean, he was so strong.
And he had, with just the flick of a wrist, could cut a throat.
I mean, absolutely. He could seal a skin in seconds.
Yeah, so because of that whaling experience. All right, real quickly, I want you to address the "they now call me doctor" line, and then we'll get to the calls for Dr. Daniel Friedman. Go ahead.
Oh, of course. When you put that in a letter too, you're trying to throw people off the track. I mean, now they call me a doctor now. Again, another clever way of steering you in the wrong direction when you think you're back on the right direction. And they thought he was a doctor now, of course, because some of the coroners said what this killer did at the crime scene in just a matter of minutes was actually purposely done. Ripper number 4 victim actually had her belly slashed open. Now, if you were a homicidal maniac or a butcher, let's say, when you were cutting open the abdomen, you would just go straight down, like with one swoop. But the Ripper didn't. He actually avoided the belly button and made a circle around it, which is a surgical procedure, like a naval flap. Cutting into the uterus of one of the victims, the coroner said this person knew exactly what they were doing, and if he had more time, would have done a masterful job of surgery. So the person who was committing the crimes had speed and knew what they were doing. Now, of course, other doctors have been implicated. Like when I was a kid, I always thought it was the Queen's royal physician, William Gull. And that was the first person I had to figure out could he have done it or not, because if not, my whole theory goes down the tubes. Well, I found out that William Gull was 72 years old at the time of the murders, suffered a stroke about a couple of months before the murders, which left like your dog, unfortunately. Hopefully it recovers nicely. But
thank you. He's doing okay.
Yeah, but this doctor had a stroke, did not recover, and his right side of his body was paralyzed. So, I mean, you got a picture, 72-year-old, pretty much out of shape, cradling his right dominant arm down the street, chasing a 42-year-old woman who could fight who could fight off a guy.
Right.
And there's no way this was the man who did the murders.
Right.
And some people say Prince Albert Victor, but I mean, you're talking about a member of royalty here. I mean, if he was walking down the streets of Whitechapel, and people did got glimpses of the Ripper. You see the Duke, the Prince walking down the street, you're going to go, oh, my God, what is he doing in Whitechapel? He doesn't belong here.
All right, well, and so I'm going to move on to the calls before we lose them because they've been holding on a little bit to talk to you. But then before we go, I'm going to leave enough time to ask you about the name that was sealed in an envelope.
By Joe Bell.
Yeah, okay, we'll get to that coming up. So first of all, first-time caller line, Jerry is in Los Gatos, California, on Coast to Coast AM for Dr. Dan Friedman, The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yes, Daniel, you're unique. You're putting something out there that sounds wild, but it's probably not as wild as it sounds. What better way to become a great writer than to pull one over on the public with a murder?
Right.
Or a series
the
of
perfect murder, the perfect crime, as Moriarty was always in pursuit of.
You're popularizing crime. You're trying to... Remember, the first two Sherlock Holmes books, A Study in Scarlet and A Sign of the Four, were flops. Doyle made absolutely no money off of those. If you're trying to sell, murder mysteries or you're trying to sell detective stories, yes, what better way is it to sensationalize it, have it all over the press? And I'm not saying that's what he did, but certainly people got a sparked interest in reading detective stories. Because remember, the detective story was kind of new; it was a new genre. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe was basically the creator of detective fiction, and Doyle was, and he tells you in a Sign of the Four and A Study in Scarlet that he wasn't really a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. He thought the stories were just too basic and simple. The Ripper crimes are not basic and simple; they are executed perfectly, orchestrated, arranged perfectly, same as the Sherlock Holmes stories. They are brilliantly put together, constructed, and people read them and went, wow, this guy's really giving you an accurate description of how things go. I mean, when you read Edgar Allan Poe, it takes you 6 months to figure out who the killer is. Sherlock Holmes tells you, no, I could do that in a day. No detective would take that long.
Or to his point about simplicity, though, the purloined letter, I believe it was, from Poe, is really it's a kid's puzzle, right? I mean, it's nothing. It's not complicated. So I kind of get where he was coming from as he reads those and then thinks, well, I could do better than that. And he does.
I mean, he's really the simple now. You don't see, it's the Sherlock Holmes silhouette that's really the symbol behind detective fiction now. Even though he's not the creator of it, he really just popularized it, and he popularized it at the right moment. He popularized it during a massive. This is London. I mean, it was the most populated city in the world in 1888 when the Ripper crimes were done. But this was like a seismic wave. It radiated across the globe, the Ripper crimes. I mean, you were reading about this in every country of the world. Japan, which just basically opened their doors to the Western world, was reading about it. Australia, America, South America, everybody was reading about this. And what better way to kind of keep it going, even though the murders were kind of done, was to read this detective fiction. And who better than
Sherlock Holmes? Joe is east of the Rockies on Coast to Coast AM for Dr. Dan Friedman.
You've established that he wasn't squeamish. He battered the seals. But I have two quick questions. One was this after the Victorian era in London, where women were out and about and kind of freely socializing at night? And my second question is, you just mentioned the first two books. Were they written before the
stories? They weren't books. They were stories. But go ahead.
Stories, rather. Stories. Were they written before the murders or after the murders?
Those are great questions. First of all, the murders took place during the Victorian era because the Edwardian era didn't occur until into the early 1900s. So these were. The fine young ladies of London were always walking chaperoned and very with people and hoity-toity, and the East End was this area where women kind of like the unfortunate class lived, and they were out at night, and they had to sell their bodies to make money to live in doss houses. And the stories that you're mentioning, The one was written in 1887. So that would be A Study in Scarlet was written in 1887. A Sign in the Four was written a couple of years later in 1891, and that one actually has a lot of those clues that relate to the Ripper crime. So A Sign in the Four really has nothing to do with it, but it does have a lot to do with things such as infidelity and revenge. And also has elements of Arthur Conan Doyle's childhood in there, which I actually discovered the secret origins of a professor that he writes about when he's 14 that actually tried to kill him, Mr. Crea. Because Crea is actually an anagram of the word Rache. And Rache was the clue that was written on the wall in A Study in Scarlet. And the word Rache means actually revenge. So that's what these murders were, an act of revenge. And that's what he was trying to show you in that one. And Mr. Crea, being the anagram being of Rache of Revenge 2, was that he wanted revenge on his mother for figuring out that she was having an affair with her medical student lodger.
Yeah. So it leaves me just enough time to get to the famous incident where with the investigating physician, right? Bell was that
Bell, who's actually he's actually one of the role models for Sherlock Holmes.
Right. And they're both Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and what was one of the role models for Sherlock Holmes, this doctor who was so good at picking up even on the smallest clues.
Right.
That they both wrote on a piece of paper and put into an envelope the name of the person that they thought had done it based on the autopsies. Is that correct?
That's what rumors have it, and it probably is true. And when you think about it, you have to remember Joe Bell is a Scottish physician. You know, he is Edinburgh. So he was able to figure out the name of Jack the Ripper from some type of medical evidence, meaning that he understood the type of surgical incisions being done at the crime scene and the type of man that could have done it. If Joe Bell would have realized that the Ripper took out a kidney, which is it sounds easy. You open up a belly, you see a kidney. You don't. It's difficult to find. And as a matter of fact, most operations on the kidney were done from the back. But the Ripper, in pitch darkness, it was the darkest corner of Mitre Square, was able to reach in, find her kidney, take it out in sheer darkness, and then take it home with them, and also poke holes in the liver of the victim. And you have to remember that Bell would have known that the Professor William Rutherford was doing those experiments with Doyle, in which he was opening up the windpipes, which is slashing their throats, opening up their abdomens, and sticking cannulas or poking holes in the livers. And if Bell would have put two and two together, that the person had surgical skills that come from Edinburgh's training, because they were the best hospital in the world at the time, at least one of the top in the world, whose procedures were very different from everybody else's, and was doing things very reminiscent of William Rutherford's work. If Bell put two and two together, he may have come up with a name. I think it's this student I had, Arthur Conan Doyle.
But if it's true that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote down who it was that he believed it was and put it in an envelope, and they were the same person, as the rumor goes, as the historical story goes.
I don't know about Arthur Conan Doyle's involvement in that part. I do know about Joe Bell's, and that's the story I've heard too.
Okay, well,
it's hard to really know what was what. I don't know if Arthur Conan Doyle would have written down his own name.
Well, that's the thing. Well, that's the part I was going to ask you about, because this is a story I've heard related before, that they both wrote down the name of that person, and then they were both sealed in an envelope, and then they were unopened later on, and they were the same name. And some people have said, well, that's proof of blah, blah, blah. You know, that they both agreed that it was the royal physician, or they both agreed that it was so. And these are the two most brilliant forensic minds of their time, and that they both agreed that it was the same person. What would that be like? If at the end of the movie, so to speak, he puts, Dr. Joseph Bell puts down Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in an envelope, and Arthur Conan Doyle puts down me in an envelope, and it's both the same.
Incredible movie. I mean, as I said before, with this thing he wrote into the Portsmouth newspaper, he actually writes. Basically, he's writing about me that whoever Jack the Ripper was had a nice clerkly hand, which he had. Was very known to write, which he was a writer. He spoke with he knew Americanisms. He knew them. He would use the words "dear boss." He did. I mean, he's actually giving you almost a confession that he's the Ripper with his investigation as if he was Sherlock Holmes. It's like Sherlock Holmes is finding out that it's my own creator that is Jack the Ripper.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's where we'll leave it for now. But so enjoyed your book. Loved the way you laid it out. Thought that was very creative. The Strange Case of Dr. Doyle, A Journey into Madness and Mayhem. One of the co-authors, Dr. Dan Friedman, thank you so much for your time. Nobody has to go there for open lines. I can't answer the questions that he would know the answers to. So where are you going to take us? Coming up next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett.